We are going to continue on with lesson 8. We've set up our local authentication, and now we also want the ability to register or log in using GitHub. So there's an npm package that we're going to need for this. We're also going to need to download this image and do some configuration in our GitHub account in order to get this working. So I've put up a link here. What we're doing, this tutorial is a bit old, actually quite old, but this describes some different strategies, including GitHub, which is using a package we're going to use called Passport GitHub 2, but it also describes LinkedIn and Twitter. So I'm going to sort of adapt this tutorial, but it largely describes what it is we're going to be doing. So step 1 is let's download this image. So what I'm going to do is right-click on this image file here on Blackboard. I'm going to choose Save Image As, and I'll show you exactly where we want to save it. We're going to go into our job tracker folder. In here, inside the public folder, if we don't, we want to create an images subfolder. So you will have JavaScripts and style sheets already. Express already builds those, but create an images folder. I've already created one, and save it in here. So we'll now see inside of public and images, you'll have our GitHub sign in. So let's add this to both our register and login views. So first I'll open up login, and maybe underneath our first login button, I'll put on another horizontal rule. And then I'll add a link that will go to /auth/GitHub. And then we'll display our image here. So our source will be /images. We don't need public because public, that's the root already. So it'll be GitHub signin.jpg, and our alt will say in. And so I'm going to add this code below the login button, above the register button. And I can also highlight those lines and copy them to your clipboard because we'll put them on our register form as well. So just copy that. We'll go and have a look. So how does this look? So now when I go to login, oh, I want to bump this over a little. I'll maybe offset it. I'll put one column of padding on the left here. So maybe in my anchor tag, we'll also give this a class of offset 1. That'll move it over to the right a little bit. Something like that. That too. Won't get too carried away with it. Oh, maybe that's even better. We'll do the same down here. So now I'm just going to copy that horizontal rule and my anchor tag and my image. I'm going to paste these things into the register form as well. We'll copy those. We'll go to register, and under our register button, same thing. We'll add our sign in with GitHub here as well. So when we click the link, it's going to go to our auth controller and make a GET request at /GitHub. So we're going to need to install the Passport GitHub 2 NPM package. And we're going to need to do some configuration. We'll actually open up, we go to NPM. The package we're going to want is called Passport GitHub 2. So it's going to tell us we're going to need to install the package. It gives us some sample code for enabling this. This will go in our app.js. So we're using a new Passport strategy, a new GitHub strategy, and we're going to have to provide some values. If you think about, remember when we did, for example, Google login in our ASP.NET applications, we had to get a client ID and client secret from Google. Well, we're going to have to generate these things in our GitHub accounts. And then there is also a callback URL. So after someone signs in with GitHub, what URL do they come back to? So we're going to have to go to our GitHub accounts and do some configuration here. Okay, so the link is here, right here on Blackboard. It's this one. I'll put it in the chat as well, github.com/settings/applications/new. So we're going to jump over here. So we are going to create a new OAuth application in our GitHub account. So I'll call it Job Tracker. We must put in the URL to the homepage. So I'm going to put in my live website. And now we need a callback URL. So for starters, I'm going to put in the local callback URL. We'll have to update this later when this is all working and we want to deploy it to Heroku. So for now, we'll use localhost 3000/auth/github/callback. So this is where GitHub is going to send users after they've authenticated. So give it a name. Excuse me. I'll put in the link to our live site, and our callback URL for now is going to be our local auth controller GitHub/callback. And then I'm going to click register application. So then we're going to get a client ID and we can generate a client secret. And we're going to need to store these things in our environment file. So first I will copy the GitHub client ID. I'm just going to copy it. We'll go to our environment file. And we will set up GitHub client ID. Actually, let's put it this way. And now we're going to generate the secret in the GitHub portal, and we will copy that to our environment file as well. So there's a button here under client secret that says we can generate a new one. And it says, make sure you copy this secret now. We will not be able to see it again. So if we don't copy it now, we would have to generate a new one. So I'll just click the copy button here. I get a green check mark telling me it's been copied. I'm going to paste it in. So those are our API keys. And now we also need a GitHub callback URL, which for now, in our local environment, is localhost 3000/auth/github. So we're going to need to use these three variables in our Passport GitHub configuration. Later, we're also going to copy these to our Heroku dashboard, but the callback URL instead will be our live domain. It won't be localhost 3000. Okay, so add your client ID, your client secret, and your callback URL. So we're all going to have the same callback URL for now, but everybody will have a different client ID and different clients. Okay, any questions so far? And if there any part of that, if you missed and you need me to go back and review, please let me know. We're going to install Passport GitHub 2 in a minute, but we also need to make a change in our user model because we will be allowing people to sign in through GitHub. So I'm going to go to Models and User. If somebody signs in through GitHub, we will get their GitHub username, but we won't have a password for them. So how are we going to kind of track that they're who they are in GitHub? So I'm going to add two optional parameters to our user schema. The first one is the Oauth provider, which will be a string. So anybody that logs in with the GitHub account, we're going to set the Oauth provider value to GitHub. So we know which users in our database are signing in with their GitHub accounts. We also are going to add an Oauth ID. So when someone does sign in with GitHub, GitHub will give us an identifier for that user. So if we have 10 GitHub users, each one will have a unique ID that GitHub gives us. Okay, so we've set up our configuration variables. We've created our application in the GitHub portal, created our API keys. We've added GitHub login into our GitHub login options into our UI. So now we basically need to install the NPM package and follow most of the code that's here. We'll need to configure it in app.js, configure the strategy, and then we'll need a couple of routes in our auth controller, one to invoke the GitHub login when the user clicks this button, and then one to process the callback. So to authenticate the user once GitHub has sent the user back to us. Right, so not a lot of code. We probably got about 20 lines here we'll need to add. So I'm going to go to my terminal. I've got a second terminal window running here. So if your app is running with NodeMon, you can just either stop it with Control-C or you can click plus and you'll just get a second terminal window. And now we're going to run npm I passport-github 2. So let's install that package. Close my terminal. And then we're going to go to app.js so we can configure So first is we are going to create a variable called Github Strategy. We're going to link to Passport GitHub 2, but to the strategy object. So we're not requiring the whole file, we're linking to a specific class inside of it. So we're going to tell Passport to use a new GitHub strategy. And this is where we set up the options. So we're going to have to provide our API keys and our callback URL. So the GitHub strategy takes 3 parameters: the client ID, the client secret, and the callback URL. And client ID, IND are both uppercase in this class. So we use our process.environment.GitHub client ID. So we're going to read these 3 values out of our environment file. And again, with callback URL, notice all caps at the end. This is just the way they named the property in the GitHub library, in the NPM package. So we have to follow it. So we're configuring our GitHub strategy with our API keys. And then after that curly brace, I'm going to put in a comma. And here's our code, our asynchronous code that runs whenever someone tries to log in with GitHub. GitHub will give us back 4 objects. One is an access token. Now, if we have time later in the course, we'll talk more about JSON Web Tokens, but this just comes straight from the documentation. We go and look. So we're configuring GitHub, we get back an access token, a refresh token, a user profile, and this done method. This is just a callback. And then we can check for this user in our database. Now this code find or create, this won't work exactly, so we're going to have to modify this a little bit. So what happens when somebody signs in through GitHub? We get an access token, we get a refresh token, we get a profile, and then we have a callback. So first we want to check if this GitHub user already exists in our users collection. And we're going to use a try catch with this because it'll handle any errors. So we're going to call find one. So we're going to check based on the user's GitHub ID if we already have this user in the database. So maybe they've logged in before with their GitHub account. If we have a user, then we will just return our callback. So if the user is found, we say, yep, okay, we know who this person is. They already have a GitHub account. And we'll just continue on with whatever code needs to run next. But what if this person, we don't have their GitHub account in our database? So if we have a user, in this case, we'll pass along their profile. Otherwise, this is a new GitHub user. So we will create a new user object. We'll set their username equal to their GitHub profile username. We'll set the OAuth provider as a string to GitHub, because later on we might add other OAuth providers, Google, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. And our OAuth ID will be the profile ID that GitHub gives us. So we can access their GitHub username and their GitHub profile ID. So then we're going to save the user. And now we'll do our callback with no errors, and we'll pass back our user. So we get 3 scenarios that can happen when someone signs in with GitHub. We've already got them in our database. We just look them up and send back that user profile. Second scenario is we don't have this GitHub user, so we are going to create an account for them in our database. The third scenario here is something goes wrong. So in this case, we will catch an error and just pass out the error back to our callback. So a little more complicated than the code we see in the NPM documentation. Why did we kind of manually try and look up the user, create a user? On NPM, they call find or create. We don't have access to this method. If we try this code, it's just going to fail. So this requires a different library to find or create. We don't actually have, I don't think we've got this. Yeah, we don't have a find and create method we can call. So that's why I didn't just copy that code from NPM. So we're doing a little bit of our own manual work here. Sure, my indenting is really good. It's a little easier to read. So there's our configuration of our strategy. We're going to look up a user. If we find them, we pass them back. If we don't have them in our database, we're creating a new GitHub user. So the last thing we need, these I think we can just copy straight from the documentation on NPM. We'll have to make a couple of changes here. So in our auth controller, we need one get method that will invoke the GitHub authentication. And then we also have to deal with the callback. So what happens when the user comes back from GitHub? So we'll actually just write these in our auth controller. And I think we should be good. So we're going to scroll down to the bottom. So this is going to invoke GitHub login attempt. So here we just call passport.authenticate, and we pass in our strategy as GitHub. We also need to set out a variable, which is the scope. We need access to the user email. This is a required parameter in square brackets. So this will start the GitHub login process when the user clicks our black sign in with GitHub button. So this will invoke the GitHub strategy app.js to check for this for GitHub user. So this will be GitHub/callback. Again, we call passport.authenticate. We'll set up our failure redirect. So if the GitHub login fails, we'll show them the login screen. Otherwise, we will redirect them to the employer screen. Oh, whoops, I just have a bracket problem here. One of these. Okay. So yeah, our curly bracket ends here. A little more readable this way. So I think our configuration should be good to try out locally. And then once, if we can get GitHub working locally, we then need to add our environment variables to Heroku and change the callback URL in our GitHub app so that it runs live. So we'll give this a try. So now I'm going to click sign in with GitHub. It asks me if I want to allow this application to access my GitHub account. So I'll say yes. I'm going to authorize. Tells me it's going to redirect back to my local domain. Okay. And we got an error. It's trying to save the user. Let's figure out. Whoops. I know what I did wrong. One little problem in app.js. This should be, sorry, we want to save our new user object. I had the word user here. This should be new user on line 66. So I'm going to try that again. So it authenticated me properly, but I had this little bug. So here it's the new user object I'm creating on line 61. We're trying to save it on line 66. So I'll just go and try again. So it authenticated me, but didn't save to the database. I can actually go to MongoDB. May as well open up my database and look in my users collection so we can see if I sign in successfully, do I get an account created in my database? So I might as well log into the database. Go to my collections and users. So right now I think I have 2 users. Yeah, there's 2 documents. I've got test@test.com and user@gc.ca. I'm going to try my GitHub login again. Now it shows my GitHub username, which is good. And if I refresh here, it now shows me I've got 3 documents, my first 2, and now it's got, here's my GitHub. So you notice there's no salt and hash value, but here's my GitHub username. We've set the provider as GitHub, and here is my OAuth ID. So this is my profile ID from GitHub. So now I'm logged in, I can add, edit, delete, all using my GitHub profile. I can sign out. I'm anonymous. I can sign back in with GitHub. And now I have full permissions again. So this is all working locally. But if I go and push this up to Heroku, my app is gonna die again. Because in app.js, we've now got these 3 new environment variables. They exist in my local environment, but they don't exist in our cloud environment. So I'm going to push my changes to GitHub. And we'll see, again, it's going to break online, which I will need to fix. That's lesson 8.2, GitHub Auth. So we'll push those changes up. I'll go back to my live site. Which probably isn't going to load now. It hasn't refreshed yet. It'll take a minute. Because notice I don't have the GitHub sign-in option yet. As soon as it syncs to my Git repository, the site's gone offline again. So now back in my configuration variables, I need to add a GitHub client ID, which I'll grab for my environment file. I need the GitHub client secret. Which I'll copy and paste. And now the GitHub callback URL, this now needs to be my live site. Or, oops. -job -tracker. And I've got to append on the end /auth/github/callback. So I'm going to copy this to that URL as well to my clipboard. So now that I've put these 3 values back in, this should fix the error. My application should load, but my GitHub callback isn't going to work. So now my site's back online, right? It's looking for those 3 environment variables. They now exist here. when I go to sign in with GitHub, now I get this error. So any guesses as to why this is happening? It worked fine locally. Why do I get redirect URI mismatch on the callback URL? So this is working fine on my local server. GitHub login, yeah, no problem. But how come it fails here? What callback URL is my GitHub application looking for? Why is it saying there's a mismatch? I've got my Heroku app in the callback here. So this doesn't make a lot of sense. This is the last thing we need to fix. Yeah, it's looking for the local callback. So Colton, where did we set? Right, so it's saying there's a mismatch. The Heroku portal is looking for it here in my live domain. How come it's trying to call localhost 3000? Where is this value being set? Any clue where we need to go to fix this? Yep, the environment file is the localhost, but remember, the environment file doesn't even get included on the server, right? The environment file is local. If we look at my repository, remember the environment file, it's in the git ignore. It's not even here. So we use this config vars instead of the environment file, but it's telling us there's a mismatch. The answer is in our GitHub application, right? When we created the application and created the client ID and secret, here's the callback URL. So we need to change this. The latter part of the URL is right, but now we need, in order for this to run, so it can't run both live and locally. GitHub doesn't allow us to put in multiple callback URLs. So sites like Google, they do. So it's RF, job, tracker, Hero. So I need my live domain as the callback URL. So this is what the mismatch means. It says whatever in the GitHub developer portal, whatever the callback URL here is, that has to match the callback URL inside the application code. So if I update it, now this means my GitHub login isn't going to work locally anymore. I develop it locally, but ultimately it needs to run on the live domain. That's more important than it working on my development machine. What's important is that it actually runs in production on the internet. So now my GitHub login should work. I think I just put in the wrong domain. Oh, yes. It's .Heroku app. Until I get that domain exactly right, let's try it again. Okay, we're getting warmer. Let's see, what did I do? Oh, same thing here. I got to edit that. and put in the proper domain. Okay, try it one more time. I think we should be good now. So now I can sign in live using my GitHub account. Locally, it probably won't work anymore because now it's going to say the callback URIs are mismatched because it's trying to redirect to my live domain. So when we're developing it and getting it working, we'll set the local host. Once it's working locally and we deploy, we're going to want the live domain in our callback URL. Okay, so one of the options you'll have for assignment 3 is to add an additional OAuth provider, something other than GitHub, and it will work similarly. You'll create a set of API keys, you'll have to set a callback URL, and you'll need to install and configure a Passport package for doing something like Twitter authentication or Google authentication. Okay, but now our application is deployed. We've used the configuration variables to store our values securely. We've secured access to resources so that our site is now read-only. And even if I try and go, I can't get in unless I'm properly authenticated, either using Passport Local or using the Passport GitHub strategy. Okay, so all the code we've done today, it's all up on GitHub for you. So you actually have 2 things due next week. I mentioned the first one. So the first one was simple. That was assignment 2, your project plan for assignment 3. There is also a quiz that's due also next Thursday night. You can find the quiz. Navigation sometimes struggle with. So for next week, what have you got to do? So you'll submit your project plan on Blackboard. Make sure you've completed the authentication we did today, including GitHub. You can ignore, we didn't deal with child documents. So quiz 2, which is a short answer quiz, you can find it in the lesson 9 folder. I'll actually open it now. Whoops, yes. So quiz is okay, so it will be due on the 17th at midnight. So short answer, and the quiz is about Passport authentication. Okay, so it's open. You have until next Thursday at midnight to do your project plan and your quiz. Next week, we will do lab 2, where you're going to give each other feedback on your project plans, and then we are going to start to dive into Angular. Yes, Bolton. So the quiz is based on the previous 2 lessons. Okay, so have a great week. If you need help with an idea for assignment 2, please let me know, and make sure you submit assignment 2 by next Thursday night.